Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China on Tibet, barriers to settling an unresolved conflict will come to order. More than 70 years after the invasion that led to Chinese rule in Tibet, Tibetans continue to struggle in the face of unrelenting opposition. Chinese authorities routinely violate Tibetans' freedoms of religion, expression, and assembly, as well as denying Tibetans self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party has waged a years-long campaign of sinicization, requiring conformity with officially sanctioned interpretations of religion and culture, not the authentic practice and teaching of Tibetan Buddhism. Contrary to that practice and teaching, the Chinese government even insists on its own authority to select the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, who authorities label a security threat. Those who express reverence to the Dalai Lama are punished. Also punished are those who express dissatisfaction with Chinese rule in Tibet. These punishments range from warnings to surveillance to interrogation and detention. The Commission's political prisoner database currently includes records of 715 Tibetans detained or imprisoned for political or religious reasons. We note that there are considerably more cases of detention in China than we can capture in the database. Increasingly, this oppression threatens the religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity of the Tibetan people. Earlier this year, we heard testimony about insidious efforts to separate Tibetan children from their parents, with nearly 80% of all Tibetan children now placed in boarding schools to disrupt the intergenerational transfer of language and culture. We are observing an extension or expansion of that practice now to children going to kindergarten. This commission has documented these kinds of human rights violations in Tibet for 20 years, and we will continue to do so. In today's hearing, our focus turns to the dialogue needed to address the aspirations of the Tibetan people for their basic rights and self-determination to be respected. Sadly, that dialogue has been frozen for 12 years as Chinese authorities refuse to meet with the Dalai Lama or his representatives. The longstanding policy of the United States is to promote dialogue without preconditions to lead to a negotiated agreement on Tibet. In other words, we recognize that this remains an unsettled conflict that must be addressed. Yet the Chinese government would have the world believe that Tibet is an internal affair and that issues of its status are resolved. This narrative ignores Tibet's history, and today's hearing aims to set the historical record straight. Our witnesses will share with us their considerable experience analyzing the history of Tibet, the international law dimensions of the conflict, the barriers to resuming dialogue, and U.S. policy on Tibet. I hope this hearing helps cut through Chinese propaganda and bring attention to the true historical underpinnings of the Tibetan quest for autonomy. I'd also like to welcome the members of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. It's good to have you here. International Campaign for Tibet. Dignitaries, other friends of Tibet, who are with us this morning while they are in town for the 8th World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet. Thank you for joining us. The causes of Tibetan human rights and self-determination need champions all over the globe, and I look forward to continuing to work with my fellow parliamentarians to advance the causes of human dignity and freedom wherever we can. Among global elected officials, few have been as great friends of Tibet as my co-chair, Congressman McGovern, who for many years has led the charge in the U.S. Congress to pass legislation and advocate for the Tibetan people. I now recognize him for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to welcome our friends who are visiting Washington for the World Parliamentary Conference on Tibet. I want to especially welcome the members of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. We have two members of Canadian Parliament here. I want to welcome my friends from ICT, and I want to welcome my dear friend Richard Gere, who has been an incredible activist and advocate for human rights in Tibet, and so we're delighted that you are all here. You know, I appreciate that we're holding this hearing on Tibet, the status of dialogue and a path forward in the Tibetan quest for rights and dignity. Congress has had a long and abiding interest in Tibet. It created Tibetan language broadcasting, scholarships and exchanges for Tibetans, and aid programs in Tibet and in exile. In 2002, Congress passed the landmark Tibetan Policy Act and codified the position of Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues. Support for Tibet transcends the partisan divide. Congressman Tom Lantos and Senator Jesse Helms stood side by side with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So did President Bush and Speaker Pelosi, who presented him with the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007. I've had the honor of authoring the two most recent Tibet bills to be enacted into law. The Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act seeks to enable diplomats, journalists, and tourists travel and see Tibet with their own eyes because Chinese officials have closed it off. The Tibetan Policy and Support Act expands the U.S. policy approach. As its key feature, the bill makes it U.S. policy that the succession or reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist leaders, including a future 15th Dalai Lama, is an exclusively religious matter that should be decided solely by the Tibetan Buddhist community, not by China. Congress and the U.S. government have advocated for the human rights and religious freedom of the Tibetan people. But the core problem remains that the Tibetan people cannot advocate for themselves. They are forced to live in an authoritarian system under a paranoid central government that sees any expression of distinct identity as a threat to their power. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, says it doesn't have to be this way. He's right. For decades, he sought to negotiate with Chinese authorities. He did so in good faith. The Chinese side did agree to 10 rounds of dialogue. They talked to the Dalai Lama's envoys, but they did not do so in good faith. Chinese officials say they will return to the table only if the Dalai Lama meets certain demands, demands that are not only unreasonable, but false. The U.S. government, to its credit, has consistently called on the Chinese to return to dialogue without preconditions, but that hasn't worked. For 12 years, the Tibetans stood ready. The Americans asked, but the Chinese turned away. Should we keep doing it this way, or should we explore some other tactic or strategy? That's the question we will explore in this hearing. Our witnesses today bring expertise and a variety of perspectives, legal, historical, policy, and personal, on the Tibet-China dialogue. We hope to hear what Congress and the U.S. government can do to help. Should we be countering false Chinese narratives? Should we reorient how we talk about the basis for dialogue? Is dialogue even possible in the current environment, and what would be the alternatives? So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to consider these important questions, and I look forward to our hearing.
And Congressman Smith, I know you're with us on Zoom. Did you wish to make an opening comment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief, and I thank you again, our co-chair, for convening this important hearing. I also want to welcome our distinguished witnesses, and including Richard Gere, who has been an extraordinary advocate for the people of Tibet and especially for the Dalai Lama. Simply put, the barrier, obviously, is the Chinese Communist Party. It has an ideological commitment to control Tibet far beyond what previous Chinese governments sought to do, which has been evident since the founding of the People's Republic of China. Indeed, 1 year after the communist government took power in Beijing and completed its control of the mainland, it invaded Tibet and sought to annex it. In 1959, of course, marked an even greater attempt to control Tibet and led to the dramatic flight of the Dalai Lama from his home country. All these years, he has been in exile, and while the world has benefited from his personal holiness and his example, he truly is a treasure shared.
Congressman, I'll interrupt for a moment. Can your sound dropped quite a bit? Can you move your microphone closer, or
I'd be happy to.
check
Yes.
that?
Thank you. Is that any better, Mr. Chairman? Hello? Is that better?
No, it's still very weak. We're checking on technical difficulties here.
Okay. Yeah, I'll check.
We can hear you. It's just very soft.
Oh, okay.
I think it looks like we have to go ahead and proceed. That's the best we have for the moment. We can hear you. It's just very light. Go ahead.
Okay, I thank you for pointing that out. And But again, as I was saying, the Dalai Lama is a treasure that we've all, and I, like my other colleagues, have met him and have been so deeply impressed by his goodness and his holiness. When we saw the extreme cruelty of the Cultural Revolution, where Maoist Red Guards despoiled so much of Tibet's religious and cultural patrimony, then of course there was the kidnapping and disappearance of the Panchen Lama, which personalizes how evil and totalitarian is the CCP and underscores the extent to which they will go to deny the Tibetan people the right to practice their faith freely and without interference. Now, today, under Xi Jinping, the suppression of Tibetan Buddhism, indeed the suppression of all religion, which Xi Jinping seeks to synthesize, has intensified. The Chinese Communist Party is intent upon committing cultural genocide. This must end. The Tibetan people must be free to practice their own faith and to choose their own spiritual leaders. And again, we look forward to our distinguished witnesses for giving us guidance on the path forward. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And we'd now like to introduce those witnesses. I'll introduce all of them at the beginning. Michael von Walt von Prague is a professor of international law and executive president of CREDA, an international non-governmental organization created to help prevent and resolve violent interstate conflicts. He is the author of Tibet Brief 2020, and he previously served as legal advisor to the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Han Xing Lao is a retired professor who taught at the City University of Hong Kong, Oklahoma State University, and Washington State University. Since retiring, he has devoted his time to Chinese history. He is the author of the book, Tibet Was Never Part of China Since Antiquity. Tenzing Taitong is a former Tibetan government official and representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to North America. He served in several roles in the Central Tibetan Administration, including as Kalon Tripa, the equivalent of Prime Minister. He has served as the Director of the Tibetan Language Service at Radio Free Asia and is currently the Director of the Tibetan Language Service at Voice of America, and he is testifying in his personal capacity. And Ellen Bork will be joining us by Zoom. She is contributing editor at the American Purpose. She previously served as a senior professional staff member for Asia on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and writes frequently about U.S. policy toward Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Dispatch, the Washington Post, and other publications. Thank you all for joining us for this hearing, and without objection, your full statements will be entered into the record. We ask that you keep your oral remarks to about 5 minutes. And so we'll start with Michael von Walt von Prague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My testimony today is based on the findings of 10 years of collaborative research, historical and legal, most of which I carried out during my tenure at the School of Historical Studies of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and the findings are published in these two books. Today, I'd like to call your attention to one of those findings and its international legal ramifications. Contrary to what the PRC claims, Tibet was historically not a part of China. Though not always independent in the modern legal sense of the term, and over the centuries subject to various degrees of Mongol, Manchu, and even British authority or influence, Tibet was never a part of China. The PRC did not inherit Tibet from the Republic of China or from earlier empires as it claims. Tibet was in fact an independent state in the modern sense of the term, in fact and law from 1912 to 1951, when the PRC took it by force. So the PRC's military invasion of Tibet constituted an act of aggression and violated the peremptory norm of international law prohibiting the acquisition of territory by the use of force against another state. And this informs the legitimacy, or not, of China's presence and rule of Tibet. China does not have sovereignty over Tibet, and therefore it is occupying Tibet illegally. That, in turn, informs the international community's legal obligations and its responsibilities regarding the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Governments are prohibited under international law from recognizing China's annexation of Tibet, and they have the positive obligation to help bring about a resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, to end the occupation of Tibet, and to enable the Tibetan people to exercise self-determination. As you stated, it is US policy to support a negotiated resolution to the conflict between China and Tibet. But US government actions run counter to that policy. The US government has stated more than once that it considers Tibet to be a part of the PRC. If it and other governments continue to do so, Beijing no longer will have any incentive to negotiate with the Tibetans. The international community will have satisfied the PRC's needs without Beijing having to make any concessions to the Tibetans. The PRC wants two things above anything else regarding Tibet: legitimacy and no foreign interference or criticism. Beijing's strategy to obtain legitimacy in Tibet from the Tibetans is failing. The Dalai Lama disputes the PRC's only claim to entitlement to Tibet, namely that Tibet has been an integral part of China since antiquity. And he is not giving in to pressure to make a statement to that effect. Beijing has therefore started demanding of other governments that they recognize that Tibet is part of China and is using their statements as a substitute for true legitimacy. Once a government accepts to regard Tibet as part of the PRC, it also accepts that Tibet and Sino-Tibetan relations are China's internal affair, outside its purview. Beijing's needs are then satisfied, and the Tibetan negotiating power, which depends heavily on the international community's upholding of international law in keeping with Tibet's status as an occupied country, is then severely weakened. And not only that, endorsing China's sovereignty claim to Tibet conditions the Tibetans to envision a settlement that can bring only marginal change in Tibet. Given what we know about China's treatment of Tibetans and also its treatment of Uyghurs, and Beijing's determination to eradicate their very identity, I ask, is marginal change what the US really wants for the Tibetan people? The conflict will not be resolved with marginal change. It can only truly be resolved if the Tibetans' basic needs are satisfied. At a very minimum, this requires a robust autonomy with guarantees and international protection endorsed by the Tibetan people in accordance with their right to self-determination. To arrive there, the international community needs to play its role. Uphold international law, treat Tibet as an occupied country, and the conflict as a matter of international responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll now turn to Professor Lau.
I want to thank this distinguished audience for enabling me to make this presentation. My theme is China's pre-1949 official historical records clearly show that Tibet was never part of China before the PRC invaded Tibet in 1950. This is an important issue because China is a signatory to the relevant covenants of the League of Nations and the United Nations, which means that since 1919, China has promised not to gain territories through military conquest thereafter. Moreover, the PRC incessantly condemns other countries for their past colonial conquests and the past bullying of China. Therefore, the PRC needs to cover up its 1950 Tibet conquest as a unification of a territory that has been part of China since antiquity. Sadly, today many governments incorrectly believe this ridiculous lie, and this is part of the reason why many Western democracies failed to provide adequate support for upholding Tibet's sovereignty. There are two important foundation concepts behind my theme. Foundation A, there is an abundance of authentic and reliable pre-1949 Chinese official historical records. The PRC version of Chinese history is very, very different from the version of Chinese history reflected in these pre-1949 official Chinese records. Foundation B, we use a comprehensive range of objective criteria to examine whether Tibet was part of China. Thus, to judge whether Tibet was part of China during China's Ming Dynasty, we use official classical Chinese records to examine, for example, number one, whether the Ming Empire had designated Tibet as part of China or as a foreign entity, say via a promulgated map. Number two, was the Ming Empire able to conduct census or collect taxes in Tibet? Number three, was the Ming Empire able to appoint or dismiss judges or governing officials in Tibet? Number four, was China's language, legal system, and monetary system used in Tibet, etc., etc. Combining foundations A and B, we can prove the following conclusion. China's pre-1949 official records clearly show that Tibet was never part of China before PRC's 1950 invasion. We also prove that PRC's so-called evidence of sovereignty over Tibet are based on not only distortions, but outright fabrications and forgeries of pre-1949 Chinese records. This means that a current permanent member of the UN Security Council militarily conquered a foreign country in 1950 and continues to subjugate it today. This crime obligates the intervention of the international community. I'm going to show you examples of these proofs. The first example is of a Ming Dynasty map. It's on your tablet. This is labeled as map 1, purported to show the entire Ming Empire. Regarding my foundation A stated earlier, this proof is from a Ming Dynasty 1461 AD government publication. That is, it comes from a very authoritative Chinese source. Regarding my foundation B, it relates to an objective sovereignty claim, depiction on a national map. This map labels, if you look at the map, you will show that the Chinese territories, the labels are framed in white lettering on black background. In contrast, it labels non-Chinese territories such as Japan in the east, and then Tibet over here on the west, in non-framed black lettering on white background. The contrast is literally in black and white. In other words, the Ming government clearly declares that Tibet is a non-China foreign entity. If you would flip the tablet, you would see that map number 2 is an example of a Qing dynasty proof. This is from a Qing dynasty 1732 government publication, purported to show the entire Qing Empire. On this map, the Qing government shows the position corresponding to today's Tibet Autonomous Region, which is a TAR, as a blank space. Hundreds of similar proofs are presented in this book that I have written. Most of them involve textual records and not just merely pictorial proofs like this, and they are, of course, much more reliable. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much for your comments and for sharing these maps and this history. And we will now turn to Mr. Taetong.
Chairman Merkley and Co-Chair McGovern, it is my distinct honor to offer testimony this morning on this hearing on Tibet and to speak briefly on Tibetan-Chinese relations in the 20th century, including efforts towards a resolution of the Tibet issue. Tibet remains an unresolved conflict ever since the establishment of the People's Republic of China. One of Mao Zedong's earliest declarations was his intention to liberate Tibet from the West and the Tibetan people from a backward and oppressive society. The Tibetan government protested immediately, citing Tibet's historical independence from the time of Tibetan kings to the rule of the Dalai Lamas, from the Tang to the Manchu Qing dynasties. With equal urgency, Tibet appealed to the United Nations and the global community, especially to India, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Unfortunately, China did not heed Tibet's protests, and the global community did not come to Tibet's defense. The People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet in 1950, easily overwhelming the Tibetan army and militia. China knew right then that rhetorical justification for such an invasion was not enough and called for negotiations to formalize an agreement. Tibetan representatives negotiated in Beijing, but disregarding any proper ratification process, were forced to sign what is called the 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. Nevertheless, for the next 9 years, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government tried to work within the broad confines of the agreement, which promised no change in the status of the Dalai Lama or the Tibetan government. However, China did not live up to these commitments, nor to the personal assurances the Dalai Lama had received from Mao Zedong. Tibetan dissatisfaction was widespread during these years, and protests against the Chinese finally culminated in the uprising in Lhasa on March 10, 1959, which led to the escape of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and thousands to India and neighboring countries. For the next 20 years, Tibet was completely shut off from the rest of the world. An extreme overhaul of Tibetan life, from its traditional Buddhist roots to Chinese Marxist socialism, was introduced, which in the latter years were consumed by the madness of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. However, in early 1979, China deemed the Tibetan issue important enough to be revisited. Deng Xiaoping invited the Dalai Lama's older brother to Beijing and declared that short of separation, everything could be discussed, meaning that short of granting Tibetan independence, China would be open to all Tibetan concerns and aspirations. This breakthrough meeting led to a renewed dialogue between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government, and 4 delegations of exile leaders were able to visit Tibet extensively to see and learn what had transpired in the 2 decades of Chinese rule. By 1984, representatives of the exile government were in deliberations with Chinese officials to address larger issues related to Tibet. However, in 1987, Hu Yabang, Party General Secretary and the main proponent of changes in their Tibet policies, died. This was soon followed by the Tiananmen students' protests and the massacre. China stepped backwards and the Tibetan issue also retreated. In 2001, however, communication with China was restored, and envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama began meeting in Beijing, and the Tibetan side presented His Holiness the Dalai Lama's Middleweight policy, seeking genuine autonomy for Tibet within the framework of the PRC. The envoys met many times, even after the unprecedented 2008 Tibet-wide protests that called for greater freedom for the Tibetan people. However, the envoys' last meeting was to be in 2010, when the Chinese ended the dialogue process. This brief overview of Tibetan-Chinese relations should show that even at the most challenging of times, China has seen the need to address the legitimacy of their rule in Tibet, and that there is perhaps now a realization of the shortcomings of their rule. China has also repeatedly initiated direct communication with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, demonstrating the obvious need to find a meaningful resolution to these outstanding issues. Ever since the Exile delegation visit to Tibet in the 1980s, to the later meetings of the Dalai Lama's envoys in Beijing, the Chinese leadership has been made much more aware of Tibetan perspectives of their rule in Tibet and of the unvarnished aspirations of the Tibetan people, both of which contradict the official Chinese narrative. Worldwide attention to Tibet has been an important part of creating greater awareness of the Tibetan issue, even in China, allowing for more liberal and reasonable views of the Dalai Lama and of Tibetan hopes and demands to have some standing. There is little doubt that public support for Tibet through the person of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and concerns for the cultural and human rights of the Tibetan people have been important factors in the US government's attention to the issue, one which has been sustained to a large degree by individual members of Congress. The continued efforts of the United States will only help remove barriers to this unresolved conflict, and it will advance the Tibetan people's desire for greater freedom and democracy. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taitong. And we're now going to turn to Ellen Bork, who is joining us via Zoom. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the members of the commission and staff, and I appreciate appearing alongside the other witnesses very much. As you all know, the United States has charted a new course towards China on a lot of issues, but Tibet so far has not been the subject of considerable revision, but it should be. Unfortunately, Tibet is often viewed as a fait accompli, a tragic but closed chapter of history. That is not the case, of course, for the party, the Chinese Communist Party. Tibet, for them, remains a cornerstone of China's aggression, both territorially and ideologically. It is part of China's assault on liberal democratic norms, which in turn will advance the party's plan to control the succession of the Dalai Lama, or at least gain deference and acquiescence to its choice of impostor. Addressing that challenge by building support for the authentic Dalai Lama now and in the future, and in particular building support for Tibetan democracy, which is his legacy, a much larger role in the US response to China. Unfortunately, the foundations of American Tibet policy make this difficult. A look back at history shows America's Tibet policy was not the product of historical facts or international law, but of outdated perceptions of America's strategic interest in subordinating Tibet to China. The US involvement in Tibet is, compared to some other powers, relatively recent, but it has played a decisive role in what's happening today. First, of course, the United States accepted Great Britain's application of the concept of suzerainty over Tibet. This is something short of sovereignty. It doesn't really, according to many scholars, it is not even applicable, but Great Britain found it useful while it was involved in the great geopolitical competition of the great game in the region. The United States accepted that term, but if you read through a lot of the diplomatic memos, you'll see how uncomfortable and ambivalent officials were about it, and as well as about the term, as well as about the concept of sovereignty. And for several decades, policy fluctuated in terms of the language used and the way the United States thought about what had happened in Tibet from the 1950s. And even before, the officials really accepted that it was de facto independent, even though the United States refused to accept requests to recognize Tibet's independence. Later on, after several decades only, it was when the United States forged a rapprochement with Beijing at Taipei's expense that the position on sovereignty really gelled. And again, this was the result of its perception of a strategic need with regard to China, and deciding to choose one Chinese priority in Tibet over another. And it's not, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that in that way it transferred deference to China over Tibet from one dictatorship that never exerted authority there, meaning Chiang Kai-shek, to a totalitarian regime, which it had decided to favor at the time. As a result of this decision, which incidentally, Vice President Mondale visited Beijing in 1979 and sort of said, we will no longer view the Dalai Lama as a political leader. And we've essentially said, we're going with your sovereignty over Tibet. Not surprisingly, with that decision taken, Tibet had to become diminished within US PRC relations. And it's not uncommon for diplomats to consider that it's an irritant in the US-China relationship, and even that Tibet can only be helped if we lower the temperature with Beijing over Tibet, which I think is exactly the opposite. Above all, this meant that the United States would not focus on legitimacy questions about the PRC's role in Tibet or give adequate attention to the extraordinary achievement of democracy in exile. That democratization process was carried out under the Dalai Lama's leadership and with the support of the Tibetan people in exile at exactly the same time that democratic transitions were occurring in Asia, in the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and later Indonesia. And that has been the basis of American policy toward the region ever since. By contrast, of course, Tibet is a huge priority for the party, and it uses Tibet. It has an international Tibet agenda. It's not just the domestic repression or inside Tibet's border that we need to focus on. It has a really corrosive agenda for Tibet, trying to impose litmus tests on the way countries and NGOs deal with Tibet. And it has a Buddhist agenda in its Belt and Road investment initiatives. It seeks to appropriate Buddhist sites and cultivate and co-opt leaders and make Tibet as a core interest, a condition of its good relations. I'd just like to note, before I give a few recommendations, the importance of understanding that many brave Chinese democracy advocates have over time challenged the party on Tibet. It's very easy to imagine Chinese people are sort of inherently nationalist when it comes to Tibet. And I think that's false. It's the product of intense propaganda and fear. And it's important to recognize that going back to Wei Jingsheng and continuing to Liu Xiaobo, there's been a thrust among Chinese Democrats increasingly to see democracy as the solution to both Tibet's and China's problems. Charter 08, the Democracy Manifesto of 2008, took this up. And although I think it was too sensitive to use the word Tibet in that document, there was a clear reference to the goal of a federal democratic communities of China. In that sense, the first recommendation I would make is to reintroduce support for democracy in China and to support Chinese and Tibetan political prisoners and activists, lawyers, and journalists more than we currently are in our relationship with Beijing. I think I'd like to suggest also an independent review of U.S. policy to go deeply into some of the issues I mentioned about the choices the United States made from the 40s on to see how the United States how its policy or its attitudes about Tibet's status fluctuated and why it made these decisions, and how they are not related. As Michael points out, our position is in violation of international law. How did this happen, and what should we understand about not only Tibet's status, but how the United States treated Tibet and subordinated to China historically? And finally, I would say we should enlist allies in a common position on the Dalai Lama's succession and make that very public, give the elected Tibetan exile government more access and support, and include it in forums like the Summit for Democracy, and counter Chinese influence in international organizations and campuses and the state and local levels, not only on Tibet, but on other questions like Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bork. And really, the expertise that all four of you bring to this conversation. We'll now have a series of periods of questioning, and I think we're set for 7 minutes. I'll be handing the gavel over to Representative McGovern after my questions, because I have another hearing to chair. But tell you, this member of the Senate will never recognize as legitimate Chinese control over Tibet. And the hearings that we have held in this commission about what China is now doing in Tibet, and in particular, I can't get out of my mind the fact that 80% of the children are being sent to boarding school to separate them from their parents and to essentially re-educate them in a false narrative and destroy the religious and cultural foundations of the Tibetan people. And this is truly an enormous crime against Tibet. I appreciate your historical perspectives. I was struck by two of you testifying about 1979. Mr. Taitong, you noted that in 1979, Deng Xiaoping invited the Dalai Lama's older brother to come and to say, short of separation, China was open to discussion of how to address Tibetan concerns and aspirations. And then Ms. Bork, you noted in 1979 that Vice President Mondale went to China and essentially recognized, if I understood your testimony correctly, recognized that the United States saw China as having legitimate authority over Tibet. How do we reconcile these two things happening in that particular year? How did one precede the other? And are they tied together? And I'd invite both Ms. Bork and Mr. Taitong to help us understand that.
Mr. Chairman, I think, as I was trying to explain very briefly, even though China had just come out of a very serious, period of the Cultural Revolution, to set China on the right course, they had to deal with many important issues, and obviously Tibet was right up there in their agenda.
Let's make sure your mic is turned on so that we're getting this recorded for...
Yes, it is. It shows that Tibet remains a key issue in the Chinese government's state of mind. Unfortunately, what Vice President Mondale declared during the Carter administration was overlooking the importance of the Tibetan human rights situation. In part, maybe we were unable to present our case to a president who had strong interest in human rights, but maybe at the time, President Carter was very engaged in establishing normalized relations with China. That's all I can say.
Thank you. And Ms. Bork, would you like to comment on the same kind of juxtaposition of those two events in 1979?
Thank you very much. I don't know the interaction or the interplay between those two events, and I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore. I suspect, getting the Tibetan leadership to acquiesce, to sort of buy into some solution, is not inconsistent with getting the United States to, sort of settle its position on its sovereignty over Tibet. So, but it would be very interesting. I've done a little research. It's not easy to know what went into the preparation for Vice President Mondale's trip. I think that would be a great subject for an independent commission.
Okay. Thank you. Let me turn to our two professors, Professor Lau and Professor Michael von Walt von Prague. Where is American leverage in bringing China back to the conversation through the dialogue about autonomy for Tibet?
Thank you. Because China's primary objective in relation to its international, in the international field in relation to Tibet, is precisely to obtain legitimacy for its rule in Tibet. questioning that legitimacy creates leverage. In other words, in the reverse, accepting or otherwise identifying Tibet as a part of China or as a part of the PRC or accepting Chinese sovereignty over Tibet today takes away any leverage the Tibetans have. It takes away the need for the Chinese leaders to approach the Tibetans, to negotiate with them, and to find an agreement that will end up with an arrangement where the Tibetans accept some form of Chinese sovereignty, rule, relationship that works for both parties. If the international community, and therefore the US, as perhaps one of the most important players in relation to China, do not question China's legitimacy in Tibet, China's sovereignty in Tibet, then that takes away that leverage.
Thank you. Professor Lau?
Thank you, sir. I can only echo what Michael has just said. I think that the United States and the world should actively counter and oppose the PRC's narrative by producing sort of solid proofs of why the PRC's version is incorrect or they're just basically telling lies. I think in the past, I've heard many people sort of denying the truth, but without producing believable and authoritative proofs. I think it's about time when the world becomes more explicit in contradicting the PRC's claim by doing just more than saying, you are wrong, I'm right, but show the proofs. That's all I know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll close with this question to Ms. Bork. Thank you, by the way, for your 5 recommendations. And one of the things you talk about is enlisting allies in a united position on the integrity of the Tibetan process for selecting the next Dalai Lama. And can you comment for just a moment, kind of the general sense of the disposition of the European Union, both in terms of that specific issue, but more broadly, the issue of establishing a clear united position that China control or authority is illegitimate over Tibet?
Thank you, Senator. There's no question that the Chinese government has made great inroads in Europe, but that, I think, on a number of issues has been slowed, if not completely reversed. Like in the United States, I think Tibet is there are many countries where there's great reverence for Tibet and the Dalai Lama. It's not viewed there quite as a strategic matter. It doesn't get quite as much attention. I think that the attention to the reincarnation issue that the U.S. Congress has showed is also spreading in Europe. I'm optimistic that some of the leading countries there in support for the Dalai Lama would step forward, but they've always been treated to that kind of divide and conquer. They've suffered so much, as you remember, the way Norway suffered after the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. So it's essential that there's some kind of burden and protection for countries as they take this position. I'm very heartened by the appointment of the new special coordinator, Uzra Zaya, and believe that there is prospect for greater attention to Tibet within U.S.-Europe relations.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to turn to Co-Chairman McGovern.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank all the panelists for being here. And let me make clear, the reason why we're doing this hearing, the reason why we've done other hearings on Tibet, the reason why we have passed legislation on Tibet is because China is not living up to the expectations of the international community with regard to Tibet. And, you know, I think there might be a perception in China that the world will soon forget and move on to something else. But I hope we're making it clear that that's not going to be the case. In fact, activity in the United States Congress on Tibet has intensified in recent years. More attention is being devoted to Tibet. And some of the topics that we're talking about here today, many members of Congress are unaware of. And they will be enlightened by this hearing. And it will bring additional perspective as we deal with other legislation impacting China in the future. So I just say to the government of China, who always gets annoyed when we do these hearings, you know what? You have a Tibet problem, and you can deal with it. You can go back to the negotiating table. I mean, that would be a good first step. And let's try to resolve these differences. But as long as you don't, as long as you pretend that there's not a problem here, please be assured that activity on Tibet, focus on Tibet in the United States and in other countries around the world will intensify. So, Professor Lau, would you say that the Chinese government's insistence that the Dalai Lama say that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity is tantamount to a demand that the Dalai Lama say something that is false?
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. The PRC knows that that claim is a lie, and they are forcing the Dalai Lama to lie with the PRC.
Thank you. Mr. Van Walt, you testify that governments using the Chinese narrative that Tibet has always been part of China is an obstacle to resolving the conflict through dialogue. Now, there has been no dialogue in 12 years. Assuming that governments made such statements as a concession to get the Chinese to the table back then, is there any reason for them to continue saying the same thing?
I think it was a mistake for governments to play China's game, and in the hope that, and I don't know what the objective was of making those statements, acknowledging Tibet being a part of the PRC. But I think it was a mistake to do so if the hope was that this would encourage China to negotiate. I think it's quite the contrary. And I think we must realize that the middleweight approach of His Holiness can only work if we're conscious that the kind of genuine autonomy that we're talking about is only a possible middle path if it is the middle between the legitimate right of the Tibetans to restore their independence on the one hand, and China's intention to fully integrate Tibet into China on the other. If we take away this legitimate right of the Tibetans, then there's really very little to negotiate that is left.
So I think it's fair to say that those governments that bought into the Chinese narrative may be thinking that that might make the Chinese government more reasonable with regard to Tibet. It didn't work.
It didn't work, and I think it is counterproductive today.
Mr. Taitung, the Chinese insist that they have the right to select the next Dalai Lama and demand that the Dalai Lama say that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Do you think that these reveal a latent insecurity within Chinese leadership about the legitimacy of their claim to own Tibet?
Definitely, Chairman. We've all touched on this issue of legitimacy, and I believe even within the Chinese leadership and in the Chinese mindset, legitimacy of the rule of the CCP is what is at stake. And Tibet, or the Tibetans, were the ones who contested that legitimacy. That's why there is total control over Tibet, yet China often finds itself in need to address it somehow, because the question of legitimacy will never be fully, satisfactory to the Chinese until the Tibetans have a proper role in that.
Thank you. Ms. Bork, given what the other three witnesses have said, what action should the United States government take to get the parties back to the table? Do you agree that the State Department should stop using the Tibet is part of the PRC phrase, as they did in the Tibet negotiations report this month? And given that the PRC was founded in 1949, would it be fair to say that the U.S. statements do not endorse the Chinese position that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity?
I'm not sure what the intention of the department was in that particular matter, but I do think there's a lot to be done before approaching Beijing. And I think dialogue can take many forms, and people may have different attitudes about it. I'm not a particular supporter of the idea of dialogue, at least not without much more coordination among the allies in support of the Tibetans. I don't think without that, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I'm deeply skeptical about the Chinese intentions with regard to any kind of dialogue. By all means, again, reviewing the defects in the American position, why they've used the language in the past, and the fact that they should stop using it, again, because it's not accurate historically and not helpful right now. Yes, they should stop using that and begin to talk about Tibet in a different way.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And look, whatever the deficiencies in U.S. policy have been over the years, I think it is fair to say that we are reorienting our policy in a way that is more in tune with what the Tibetan community wants. And I just want to say that we're working on a bill that we'll be introducing soon to help the U.S. government counter Chinese disinformation on Tibet and ensure that U.S. policy supports the basis for the Dalai Lama's quest for genuine autonomy, and also, making it clear that facts matter, and that you can't rewrite history because you don't, maybe because you want to. I mean, history is history, facts are facts, so again, I think that there is a renewed interest in the United States and in other countries around the world. As we witnessed yesterday, talking to parliamentarians from all over the world who are in Washington to find ways to support the Tibetan people, that I think things are changing globally. And I wish they had changed a long time ago, but they're now changing. My time is up right now. I'm going to recognize Senator Ossoff.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to comment on the intersection of press freedom and the issue at hand today. Last week in the commission, we heard from Undersecretary Zaya, who committed to me to work with my office to expand press freedom internationally and strengthen U.S. leadership for press freedom. My question, please, beginning with you, Mr. Tong, is how does the CCP repress freedom of reporting and publication within Tibet, more broadly within China? How does the CCP seek to influence reporting and publication on related issues internationally? And when you're concluded, we can move to Ms. Bork. I'd like to hear from each panelist on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. There are no press freedoms in Tibet or in any of the Tibetan areas within the PRC. And no foreign journalists are allowed to visit Tibet freely. Very rarely and occasionally, groups of Western journalists who are stationed in Beijing might be allowed on a short trip that is fully managed by Chinese officials. So as with regard to press freedom, I think Tibet is regarded as one of the worst, even worse than North Korea, according to Freedom House, I believe. So we are only able to get news items, news reports through personal contacts of Tibetans who are in exile and occasionally through social media.
Thank you, Ms. Bork.
I certainly concur with what Mr. Tetong has said. I think it's important to think about the way China is, projecting its and challenging norms of freedoms. And we have to be really very attuned to the way they present the way they treat rights, but the way they'd like to alter the way the world respects universal norms. So I don't have anything to add about inside Tibet, but I would be very alert to the way they talk about, the way Chinese Communist Party's officials talk about democratic norms, including press freedom, and try to shape them, particularly in countries where they have a great deal of influence or where they're trying to acquire influence.
Thank you. Mr. Walt, Prague.
Yes, I don't have anything to add about the press freedom or the lack of it in Tibet. What I would say is that at the same time, China is, in a sense, abusing the freedom of the press internationally, outside of China, by using the press very actively to project its narrative on Tibet, to project also its vocabulary on Tibet. For example, many members of the press write articles in which they refer to Tibetans as a minority, one of China's minorities, which is an implicit acceptance of Tibet being part of China and the Tibetans being one of China's people's minorities. Whereas in effect, the Tibetans are not a minority. They are the population of Tibet. They are the people of Tibet, and they are a people under international law with the full right to self-determination. And so that's just one example, but there's so many examples of articles in the press and reports in the press that use Chinese terminology in regard to Tibet.
Thank you. Ms. Lowe.
Thank you. I'm not an expert in this area and have nothing of value to add, but I would like to use this opportunity to emphasize something else that was brought up just now. China or the Qing Empire never had any power in selecting the Dalai Lama, and that's clearly reflected in the official Chinese records. The Qing Empire only made a request to the Tibetans to use a golden urn to do one minor step of the selection by drawing lots, and that was all. And even that request was not consistently followed or acceded by the Tibetan authorities during the Qing dynasty. Thank you.
Thank you all for your responses. Thank you for the additional context and information. I worked prior to my election producing investigative reports of crimes, official corruption, crimes against humanity, and freedom of press and freedom of publication are under attack worldwide. The United States government must strengthen and redouble its commitment to stand as vanguard for press freedom around the world, and to our hearing will help inform our efforts to that end. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Congresswoman Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every person has the right to religious and cultural beliefs, and all governments, including the CCP, have no right to restrict this fundamental belief. It is inexcusable that the people of Tibet are not free and are currently met with punishment ranging from warnings and surveillance to interrogation and detention. We cannot sit while Tibetans are being detained and imprisoned for political and religious reasons. And I was honored to meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama in my district, and we have to make the world know leaders of Tibet cannot go back to his own country and his own people because of CCP oppression. With that, to all the witnesses, with the current abuses by CCP to oppress autonomous regions, what should the United States and other countries to do stand with the Tibet people and working? I'm just asking all the witnesses, so anybody wants to answer, love to hear that. And can global cooperatives play a role in raising awareness about the Tibet oppression That's what I asked last year before the Winter Olympic. And I wanted these corporations that spend billions and billions of dollars in advertising, they can use their platform to know, but I didn't get any responses, from any of those 17 in the Olympic sponsored corporations. So could you let me know? You can start with, I guess, Ms. Borg.
I'm so sorry. I have to, if someone else could start, please. I'm having trouble hearing.
Yeah, Congresswoman, if you could just repeat the crux of your question again, because it kind of went in and out. So.
With the current abuses by CCP to oppress autonomous regions, what should the United States and other countries work together to stand with the Tibet people? And can global corporate companies play a role in raising awareness about the Tibet oppression?
Thank you very much for the question. I think international solidarity and coordination on all these points is vital, given the party's adept use of tools like financial diplomacy and propaganda and various other kinds of intimidation. Not to mention, we haven't even talked about how China continues to redefine Tibet to the point that it is referring to Northeast India as Southern Tibet. So this is very much an ongoing issue that requires staunch and coordinated reply. There was an interesting proposal unrelated to Tibet from a fellow in Scandinavia about an economic Article 5 for NATO. I think it's certainly worth discussing the kind of retaliation that countries could experience if they take a more, not forceful, but a more thoughtful and principled stance on Tibet. You really can't prepare enough for that eventuality. And I'd certainly recommend that Congress think about that as well. As for global companies, they haven't really, I guess I'm too negative. I only know the bad examples. Maybe someone else knows some good examples of companies on Tibet. But I do think that attitude is changing as a result of the Olympics and some other, the NBA and things like that. I think, unfortunately, there's still a market for companies to kowtow to the Chinese line on Tibet and other issues, but I do think it's changing and people are more sensitive to that. So I'm a little more optimistic than I might have once been.
Thank you. Any other witnesses?
I would like to make two observations that follow on what Ellen Borg has just mentioned. Regarding cooperation among countries, I think it's also very important to emphasize that not only is this of crucial importance for Tibet and the Tibetan people themselves, but this has broader international ramifications because the appeasement of China on Tibet for the past 70 years is not unrelated to China's expansion today, or its efforts to expand in the South China Sea, where it uses a similar historical narrative as it does to claim sovereignty over Tibet, and its aggressive stance in relation to northern India, both in the eastern and western part of northern India, and as Ellen Borg mentioned, even calling one part of northeast India southern Tibet, where it makes territorial claims, again, directly related to its historical narrative of Tibet. So one cannot accept the historical narrative on Tibet and then contest China's claim to northern India, or perhaps even it makes it difficult to contest their claim to the South China Sea islands. And the second question regarding corporations, the only thing I would mention is that, again, under international law, because China is denying the Tibetan people their right to self-determination, which they have, and because it is occupying Tibet, corporations and governments are forbidden from benefiting from the exploitations of resources in Tibet, because those resources, under international law, belong to the Tibetan people. And therefore, they cannot be exploited, one cannot benefit from it without the express permission of the Tibetan people given freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. And the CCP continues to have oversight of Tibetan religious life by mandating political education for monks and nuns, creating apparatus to surveil and manage monastic institutions. Can you expand more on how the CCP authorities continue to reorient Tibetan society? I think maybe Professor Lau.
Actually, I would like to comment on the earlier topic that you brought up. I think it's important for the world to realize that the Tibet issue is not necessarily just a China issue. I read in the mainstream newspaper articles in the past several days that they have pointed out that Putin is going to recreate the old Russian Empire by bringing up all this historical justification of sort of territorial rights even over the Baltic nations. If you look at the Chinese records clearly show that Tibet wasn't part of China, but it does indicate that Burma and Korea and Thailand and Laos and a whole bunch of these areas were clearly part of China. It also indicates that even countries like Holland and Portugal were tributary countries to China. So as we have seen what has developed in the Putin's and in Ukraine's case, if we do not explicitly reject this kind of an attitude, there is always a possibility, a strong possibility, that 20 years from now, when China becomes even stronger, then they're going to bring up these old claims of sovereignty over Korea and over Vietnam, and then, as I've said, even over Portugal. And I think that's the point that I would like to make. Thank you.
I would just like to add a comment that, yes, it is on. For the last 20 or 30 years, global attention to what is happening in Tibet, and especially concerns expressed by the United States Congress, has had a tremendous impact in the situation in Tibet. I think the rights of the Tibetan people and the safety of the Tibetan people to a great degree has been provided simply because the outside world is looking, and especially the United States is watching. For a long-term sort of goal to help and resolve the Tibet issue, I think, as my co-panelists have said, we should not look at Tibet and the Tibetan people as a sort of a unique element on their own, but that this is an issue that concerns the whole world. And when we deal with any development in Tibet, of course, we are going to look at it from the human rights of an individual Tibetan. Therefore, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is should be a central theme to work with. And along with that, as far as the Tibetan people are concerned, their right to self-determination should be an underlying feature of how we deal with Tibet in the future.
I totally agree with Professor Lau, because China is one of the biggest threats in the whole world. And if we don't stop right now on their CCP's invasion and oppression to autonomous regions, then you know what? In 20 years, the kind of map that we're going to have. So this is very important meeting. I really appreciate that we can have and we can really hear from witnesses. Thank you for coming out, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So I have a series of questions, and I'm going to get through them all, and so bear with me here. So, Mr. Van Walt, your testimony addresses the concept of self-determination as core to your thesis. Can you discuss the gap, if any, between the basis of the right to self-determination in international law and the extent to which governments honor and protect that right? And how would you respond to those who say Tibetans are not entitled to self-determination?
Thank you very much for the question. Self-determination under international law is a basic right. It is both a basic right and it is codified in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in its very first article, because there is a recognition, and there was a recognition when those two conventions were written, that without honoring the right to self-determination, many of the other human rights are difficult to conceive of and to respect. And therefore, it is dependent to some degree on respecting the right to self-determination. But self-determination is also a fundamental principle of international relations, as many UN declarations make clear that respect for the right to self-determination is a fundament of friendly relations among states. And so both these things are truly fundamental. At the same time, self-determination as it has developed was for a long time considered to be primarily a right of countries to decolonize from Western colonialism, but increasingly it is being recognized that when we're speaking about colonialism, we're speaking about the nature of rule, the nature of the relationship between a dominant power and a subjugated country, a subjugated people under alien domination. And regardless of whether it is a Western power, regardless of whether there is an ocean between the, if you like, the cosmopolitan country and the colony, colonialism is about the nature of relations and exploitation. Under that concept, Tibet very clearly is under colonial rule today. And I think it should be recognized that way. The PRC just introduced this at an earlier session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, a resolution on the continuing, and I don't know the exact words, but something like the continuing consequences of colonialism. Even within that context, we should be using colonialism to address the situation in Tibet. Aside from colonialism, Tibetans also, because they are a people under any definition in international law of a people with the right to self-determination, Tibetans fit squarely in that category. In terms of the difference between, in other words, their right to full self-determination and the honoring of that internationally, there is, I think, a big gap. In the 1950s and 60s, a number of countries, including the United States, recognized and supported the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. And as you know, there is a United Nations General Assembly resolution on that subject in 1960 that recognizes the Tibetans' right to self-determination and calls on for its respect and for its implementation. So Tibetans have had that recognition internationally. The discrepancy is that today many countries, probably most countries, do not refer to the Tibetan people's right to self-determination anymore, simply out of fear of displeasing China. And I think it is very important to restore the situation to where it was universally recognized that Tibetans had the right to self-determination.
Thank you. Ms. Bork, you have written about how democracy should be a component of our policy on Tibet, keeping in mind that the CTA has established a democratic form of government in exile. The Biden administration has created a process to prioritize this issue called the Summit for Democracy. And as I understand it, the CTA was not involved in the first summit meeting last December. Would you recommend that the administration include the CTA in the upcoming summit this December? And if so, how?
I would very strongly recommend that. It seems to me it would be a great oversight to continue to neglect this achievement, especially if the administration is trying to develop, support for the reincarnation as an element of, essentially liberal democracy and liberal democratic norms being respected, human rights, and so forth. So yes, I would strongly do that. I don't see any reason. I don't know the sort of governing basis for inclusion. Whatever it is, it can include representatives of a democratically elected body, even if they are not a sovereign country. So I hope so.
Thank you. Mr. Tibetan, you have firsthand experience dealing with Chinese interlocutors, including during your participation in a fact-finding delegation to Tibet. What perspective can you provide on the Chinese attitude toward dialogue with the Dalai Lama?
Mr. Chairman, I think through the interactions we've had with the delegations that visited Tibet in the 80s, I was a part of one of the groups, and the later interactions with the envoys I've had, which has been very extensive, although the Chinese government brought the process to an end, we know that during that process, many key officials in the Chinese government and in the United Front officials became fully aware of, shall I mention, the misrule in Tibet, and also fully aware of what Tibetan intentions, what Tibetan hopes and aspirations were. And so there is, within the Chinese government and leadership, I think, a full understanding of where the Tibetans stand and where they could make accommodations for. It's not as though the Chinese leadership is ignorant about the real situation. So while on one level it seems like the negotiations have stopped, we know that there are elements within the Chinese leadership and the Chinese government who can, given maybe the right circumstances, take up Tibet once again. So this process and the possibility of dialogue, renewed dialogue, and an initiative from the Chinese side, I think remains very possible.
And Professor Lau, are the maps and documents that you cite available in archives inside of China? And do researchers and historians in China have access to the information? And to what extent is this information digitized and online or otherwise available at libraries outside of China?
Thank you for your question. Please allow me to answer a preceding question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to add to what Michael has said about self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party, in the earlier version of the party constitution in the 1930s, repeatedly affirmed the self-determination rights of the so-called minorities with explicit sentence stating that up to the level of independence and seceding from China. In other words, they practically advocate, if not at least agree to the rights of the Tibetans and, well, actually the Xinjiang Uyghurs too, to form independent countries. They only deleted those clauses after they gained power after 1949. Is that okay? Now to answer your question. Actually, in my book, which is written in Chinese, and my target audience is people in China, I wanted to sort of convince the people in China that they haven't done the right thing with respect to Tibet. So I have actually taken totally Chinese chauvinistic approach. I dismiss all Tibetan records. I dismiss all Western records. I only use Chinese records that are authored by Chinese, written in the Chinese language, from the 13th century up till 1949, before the Chinese Communist Party took power. And I also restrict myself to only these old records that were reprinted by the People's Republic of China, indicating their acceptance of the authoritativeness of these publications. And yes, most of them are digitized by companies or libraries under the PRC rule. And I think actually 80% of them are not only available and digitized, they are available free of charge in public websites. And I very explicitly tell my readers, don't believe in a single word that is in this book. Go to the internet and check it up yourself. The two maps that I'm showing over here, they are available for free on websites. Many of them operated within the PRC. Many of them operated by official units of the PRC.
So maybe President Xi ought to visit the library or go online.
Well,
I just want to make sure. Congresswoman Steele, I don't know if you have an additional question. I see you're still on the line, but do you have additional questions?
No,
or?
I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just love to listen.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Van Walt, what other governments have made statements about Tibet being part of China? I mean, how many also say since ancient times? Can you provide examples of how the Chinese narrative has been embraced by the international community?
I can't give you exact numbers of how many governments have and how many governments have not. I know that some governments, and I know that because I've spoken to their officials, have been very careful not to make any explicit statements, despite pressure. Others have been pressured, especially after, for example, somebody high up in the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister, has received His Holiness the Dalai Lama. After that, they're subjected to a tremendous amount of pressure, and a number of them then make a statement to the effect that they recognize or that they identify Tibet as a part of the PRC. A good example of that is France, which after President Sarkozy, in his capacity of President of the European Union, met with His Holiness in Poland, France was put under a lot of pressure and made a statement that since the time of Charles de Gaulle, France recognized that Tibet was a part of China, which is actually not true, or not accurate, I should say. But that is an example, and that this the statement continues by saying, and this will not change. Denmark was pressured to make a similar statement, and Denmark added that the Danish government does not support Tibetan independence. A little bit in the same way as President Obama added that statement as well. I think that addition is even more harmful and completely unnecessary. It takes away and violates the Tibetans' right to self-determination, to say that they cannot have any say in their future because we do not support a particular outcome. And again, it reduces the leverage for Tibetans should negotiations take place, this type of statement.
Thank you. And I think our position is that Tibet's true representatives are the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, as recognized by the Tibetan people. And that is the direction that our government should follow, as well as other governments around the world. Let me, Mr. Taitung, the position of the Central Tibetan Administration is that the Middleweight approach proposed by the Dalai Lama is the only viable solution to the Tibet problem. And would you characterize the Chinese government's response to the Tibetan position as their disagreement that the Middleweight approach is viable, or is it a denial that there's even a Tibetan problem at all?
That's a difficult question to answer. It seems very complicated. couldn't understand what you were saying, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone, I mean, I guess the question is, you know, again, His Holiness outlined this middle way approach. You know, the Chinese government is, hasn't responded, right? The question is it that they cannot see themselves getting to the middle way approach, or is it basically they feel they don't have to because there isn't a Tibetan issue they have to deal with?
I think it may be more of a lack of confidence on their part in how to deal with the Tibet issue, afraid that if they are able to make give in to Tibetan to the Tibetans, other issues will arise within China. Although the Tibetan situation is not entirely comparable to any others, but that may be one reason. And the basic reason I think I tried to point out earlier is that within the Chinese leadership, from a position of being confident and trying to find a solution during Ho Yabang, Deng Xiaoping's time, it has retreated into another direction. And we may have, this middle way policy may have suffered that situation.
And I apologize, I just have a few more questions. I just think it's important to establish a full record here. Yes. Not only for the commission, but for my colleagues. Ms. Bork, you know, there have been many meetings between between U.S. presidents and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Would you say that these meetings have strengthened the hand of the Dalai Lama vis-a-vis China? And if President Biden were to meet with His Holiness during his term, what would you advise him to say?
I think the reception by U.S. presidents of the Dalai Lama has been extremely important, and also because it's become so regular, it would be wonderful for President Biden to be able to visit with the Dalai Lama, or if travel for either one of them were, you know, a problem, having a vice president call on His Holiness would signal American support and an effort to restore some of the, break down some of the isolation that His Holiness has experienced from over years. What should he say? I think it's very much a part of the broader U.S. policy toward China. The democratic basis of government for Tibet and China should be the U.S. president seeks. And committing to that and committing to support Tibetan democracy in exile, but also Tibetan democracy eventually, and Chinese democracy under whatever arrangement both people can agree on should be the goal. I don't see any problem with the United States standing. In fact, I think it's imperative.
Thank you. Professor Lau, Mr. Van Walt's books argue that it is inappropriate, if I'm mischaracterizing your books, correct me, that it is inappropriate to apply the modern definition of sovereignty to Tibet and its neighbors because ruling powers in East Asia related to each other in ways that were distinct from the Western notion of sovereignty, that was applied later. Does your research conform to this view, and how would you characterize Tibet's relations with its neighbors over the centuries?
Thank you for the question. As far as I could tell, there are many places where in the Chinese official records, many entities were referred to as countries, which is in Chinese, Guo, the country. And Tibet was also referred to as a country, Guo, just like Vietnam and just like Holland and these other countries. So now, if you look at the history of of Tibet over the past 1,000 years, they are not that dissimilar or that different from the histories of Germany or China or whatever. And there's, at some time, there was unified into a central administration, and at other times it was fragmented, and there were all these principalities. And so I guess your question itself would take hours to debate, and I'm not good enough to answer the question. Certainly, by the Qing Empire's time, well, actually, even before that, I think by the 15th to the 16th century, Tibet became sufficiently unified, and they had, all the structure of a government, such as legal codes, taxation, central taxation, so forth, that would qualify to be a country. But I've always felt that that's, pardon me for saying this, it's a less relevant question. The more relevant question is that, was Tibet part of China? And if Tibet wasn't part of China, to put it bluntly, it's really none of your business whether Tibet itself was a country. So on one hand, I would say, yes, Tibet was definitely a country compared to the standards that would be applicable to China and Germany since the 15th century or so. But again, I want to repeat that that's probably an unnecessary sort of a confusion to the issue. The more important issue is that nobody has the right to judge whether Tibet was a country. The more important thing was that was Tibet part of somebody else's territory, and if it's not, then leave Tibet alone.
Thank you for clarifying all that for us. Let me ask one other question, and then this is to everybody here. I mean, in any closing remarks that you want to make. In May, in a May press conference with the Japanese Prime Minister, President Biden said, "I believe what Putin is attempting to do is eliminate the identity of Ukraine, the identity. He can't occupy it, but he can try to destroy its identity." And, I think those words are true with what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, but I think they're also applicable to what China is trying to do in Tibet. I mean, when we visited Lhasa back in 2015 with Speaker Pelosi, it is clear what they're trying to do: deny Tibetans the access to their religion, prevent them from speaking their language, honoring their customs, being who they are. And they're doing it in 1,000 different ways, and displacing people. It really is quite horrific what is going on. The brutality is really horrific. But how should we view Tibet through the lens of what President Biden's comment about eliminating the identity of Ukraine? And I will ask you all to respond, and anything that you think we should add for the record, this is the time to make that clear as well. So why don't we begin with Mr. Van Walt?
Thank you very much, sir. I think what is happening in the Ukraine, Russia's war with the Ukraine, is bringing home a number of issues that are directly related to Tibet as well. I mean, we are obviously shocked by the blatant aggression against the Ukraine, and reminded that exactly the same happened a little over 70 years in relation to Tibet. And President Biden also made a statement to the effect that taking another's territory by force is unacceptable, that it violates fundamental norms of our international order. I couldn't agree more. And I think that should apply to Tibet. In terms of the destruction of the very identity of the Tibetans, and I believe the same is true when we look at the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. It has become very clear, I think, at this point, that the very policy of the PRC and of the Chinese Communist Party is precisely this, to destroy the identity of these peoples, because they have found them to be an obstacle to their full integration in China. And not only that, but they have found that as long as there is a sense of identity in the Tibetan case and in the Uyghur case, both very closely linked to their religious beliefs and traditions, that the CCP will not be able to fully control the Tibetans. This is linked also to the question of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. It is all of Chinese policies today under Xi Jinping are geared at full and total control of the Tibetans, whether it is through the Dalai Lama by picking him and educating him in accordance with CCP views, or whether it is by taking the children and placing them in this network of colonial schools, or whether it is by suppressing religious freedom and other things as well. So yes, it is, the intention is to rub Tibet out of the map in terms of the identity and the distinctness of the Tibetan people. As part of that, there is a strong effort to rob the Tibetans also of their history, since that's also tied to their identity and is a continuing embarrassment to China's attempt to continue to rule Tibet.
Mr. Lau?
Well, I would like to reiterate 2 points. The first point is that I hope the United States and other governments would sort of counter and directly the claims of some of these empire revivalists, and we are seeing that, of course, in Putin's case, and then very likely a few years later we'll see that explicitly expressed in China, that they can use historical fabrications to sort of justify their attempts to reunify ancestral lands. And that really comes to the second point, and that is I hope that in future in schools throughout the world, that people will try to change this ingrained perception, and I know very much it's very deeply ingrained in Chinese like us, and that it's very important for you to be a national of a big country, of a powerful country. They somehow believe that that is essential to the well-being. My background is that I was born in Singapore, and of course I've seen countries like Liechtenstein and Switzerland, and people in Singapore and Liechtenstein, they have no interest in enlarging the country, and people can live very well. But people who are educated in Russia and China, it never came to their mind that they could live happily ever after if they lose Xinjiang or Ukraine or Tibet or whatever it is. They think it's the end of the world if our country, is splintered and then Tibet is gone and then Xinjiang is gone. I think it's important for us to, using the voice of America, whatever, is to somehow try to tell people explicitly that people in Switzerland and Liechtenstein live very well. I think this is all the message that I have.
Thank you. Mr. Tejon?
Thank you, Chairman. With reference to what's happening in the Ukraine, I think one can say that 70 years ago, Tibet was in the same situation, and unfortunately, the world community could not come to Tibet's assistance. We hope the attention and focus on Ukraine will be much better, and the outcome will be better too. And for the record, I think I would like to take the opportunity on behalf of all Tibetans to express our acknowledgement and gratitude to the United States government for the attention and focus on what's happening in Tibet. Clearly, a tremendous amount of change has happened in Tibet for the better because there is attention from the outside world, and especially in the United States. And I think we especially acknowledge members of Congress who've taken the lead, and with your leadership at this time on the Tibet issues as well. I think I would like to say thank you on behalf of the Tibetan people.
Thank you. Ms. Borg?
Thank you very much. Just in closing, as you're talking about what happened 70 years ago, I just wanted to mention that the United States took a very principled position in support of the Baltic states against the annexation of the Soviet Union. There are some dissimilarities, but not really serious ones in my view, and it's really valuable for the United States to look back at the constraints it's imposed on itself over these decades, acting on behalf of Tibet and making the Tibetan exile government's position stronger in trying to reach some kind of improvement. And in that regard, I think a strategic, focusing on Tibet as a strategic issue is vital. For the record, I will pass along to the staff a readout of a tabletop exercise that several of us conducted in 2019 about the future, the passing of the Dalai Lama, and how governments will respond at the time. Clearly, that is an exercise that needs to be repeated, and it would be something that I think members of Congress would find useful to think about being prepared for that eventuality, and what China will do and what the United States and its allies should do in prep. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for your testimonies. And I think this is a very important hearing because in our discussions on Tibet, some of the topics that we covered here today we don't go to, including the historical facts of the fact that Tibet has not been a part of China since ancient times. I think everybody here has disputed that very clearly. And look, our focus is on standing with the people of Tibet to protect their identity, to protect their history, to protect their culture, and to protect their human rights. And I believe that we in the United States, and Mr. Tatung, I appreciate your kind words, but to be honest with you, we're not doing enough. The world community is not doing enough. If we were, we would be having a very different discussion right now. And it's complicated. There are corporate interests involved, urging governments not to rock the boat because they're all, worried about continued corporate profits and, strategic issues involved. Nobody wants to rock the boat with China. We're very good at talking the talk. We're not very good at always walking the walk on these issues. And I think that's changing. And I really do. I mean, I look at the last few years here in the United States Congress. I mean, we have legislated more. We have created more policy on Tibet than at any other time. And, as I said, that, Tibet's true representatives are His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, as recognized by the Tibetan people. And I think that should be our guiding principle here as we move forward, right? I mean, so it's not up to what President Biden wants to do, or it's not up to what President Xi wants for Tibet. It's not what the President of France wants. It's what the Tibetan people want. I mean, that is and so any solution, any way forward has to be what the Tibetan people want. It can't be imposed by somebody who's not part of the Tibetan community. And I think there's a growing recognition of that. And the Tibetan government in exile is showing an embrace of democracy, which is really inspiring. I've witnessed some of the election. I've watched online people voting in far-off places, and participating in this process. It really is inspirational. But I've also met with families whose loved ones have been torn apart from them. People who don't know where their mothers or fathers are, who have disappeared. I mean, it is cruel. I mean, it is horrific. And and again, we are moving forward with additional legislation. We are encouraged by the new special coordinator in this administration. We will work with her to have her not only be a spokesperson for what U.S. policy should be, but working with the international community. I mean, I was, particularly grateful that, we are meeting, this hearing is at the same time that the World Parliamentary Conference on Tibet is meeting. I mean, this is not just a U.S. issue, it is a global issue. And if we care about human rights, this has to be a central issue. I mean, you go all over the world and you have these countries, oh, human rights, human rights, human rights. Well, if you can't stand up to China on something like this, then let's stop talking about human rights. And to the Chinese government, look, I mean, if you want to do something constructive right now, you should re-enter the direct dialogue that you walked away from 12 years ago. This issue is not going away. And so I appreciate everybody being here. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a written statement from the International Campaign for Tibet and an additional paper by Professor Lau. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, June 24th, for any items that members would like to submit for the record or any additional questions for the witnesses. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.